It's my pleasure to introduce Andrew Coghlan, Head of Emergency Services at Australian Red Cross, to give a keynote this afternoon. Andrew, could I welcome you, please?
Thank you, Ian, and thanks everyone for giving me the opportunity to be here, which is quite an honour. I just want to clarify before I begin, though, I'm assuming that I won't be up to the scratch of winning the $5,000, but I'm working on the basis that I might get one of the runner-up prizes that are guaranteed. So here's hoping. Anyway, let me start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting, as Ian mentioned earlier, the Wurundjeri people of the Coghlan Nation. Important to do that, I think, particularly this week for very obvious reasons. And let's hope that, for all our First Nations peoples who might be with us today, let's hope that the weekend is okay for them. And likewise, things settle down somewhat next week and we see some progress in whatever way, shape or form. A couple of other acknowledgements I wanted to make as well, if you'll bear with me. The first of those is the people of Israel and surrounds. Some really grim times over there, to somewhat understate it. But I think, again, highlights the sort of trauma that people go through. And I've seen a number of people on the news this week on various different talk shows and things like that, talking about the trauma that people are experiencing in that event or that situation. Not dissimilar to what we see in a lot of disasters, different context, but a lot of the reactions, a lot of the suggested ways forward or ways of dealing with it for those people come from or are at least shared with what we do in a disaster context. And the other one I would flag is today is in fact the 21st anniversary of the Bali bombings. So for a lot of people, that's a significant day. We're not that far away here from a memorial on Swanston Street in a place called Lincoln Square, a couple of blocks from here or a handful of blocks from here, which signifies and commemorates the lives lost and the people who were injured in that event. And what I want to focus on very much in the next 15 minutes or so is the very human impacts of disasters. I want to touch on disaster risk reduction, obviously, but do it through the lens of the impacts on people, what it means to people. And for those people who went through an experience such as the Bali bombings 21 years ago, I would imagine that, I don't know if we'd still call it recovery 21 years on, but their lives would be very different than what they would have been had those events of 21 years ago not happened. So that journey, if you like, that adaptation, that adjustment continues on for people in different ways, shapes and forms. And the last of the acknowledgements that I wanted to make was just to, again, thank NHRA for their efforts in putting today on. Fantastic opportunity for the researchers, for those of us who are gathered to listen to those fantastic presentations this afternoon. And just to really identify and recognise the fantastic advances we've seen in bringing research and practice together over the last 10 to 15 years in particular, through most recently NHRA, but before them the CRC. I think the way in which research is now informing how we do things and ultimately community outcomes is a really substantial step forward and a really good move in terms of what disaster risk reduction is and what it ought to be and what it ought to do. Enough of the introductions, let me get into things. And what I would like to do over this next few minutes is to touch on a few different things. The focus on disaster risk reduction, why that's important and why we want to do that. Secondly, the role of research. I've mentioned that it has nowadays a significant impact on how things occur and the way in which things are done. And I want to highlight a couple of examples from my own Red Cross experience that I think are worth highlighting. And the third one, some of the considerations on the horizon. What does the future look like? What are we going to be thinking about? What do we need to be thinking about? And we've already heard some of that. I'd like to just expand a few thoughts as we go. When Blythe was kind enough to invite me to do this presentation this afternoon a few weeks back, I went in and I did the old thing of, let's look up what disaster risk reduction is and what it means. And if you just type in disaster risk reduction, you get multiple definitions, as you do with anything nowadays. Complex, complicated. So at the end of the day, I landed back with the obvious starting point of the Sendai framework, which provides the I guess, the governance arrangements at an international level as to why and how disaster risk reduction ought to take place. And I'm not going to read it to you, but I would highlight that there's an obvious desire in their definition to stop disasters happening, obviously. That would be the preferable outcome for us all. But more broadly than that, disaster risk reduction is also about reducing the impact or the risk to people's lives, their livelihoods, and their living standards by reducing either the occurrence of disasters or indeed the impacts of the sometimes inevitable. And I think all the presentations we've heard this afternoon, wow, that's very much on cue, isn't it? I didn't set that up. And the other thing they've done within Sendai is to highlight 4 priority areas: the understanding of risk, the strengthening of those arrangements to manage that risk, investment for the future in resilience and disaster risk reduction, and enhancing that preparedness and building back better in recovery. And again, I think we've had some really fine examples of ways in which that can happen this afternoon. So that's a little bit of the theoretical framework, but what about the reality? And we've already had a few people touch on this in the presentations this afternoon. So I'm not going to labour it, but I really wanted to highlight it. If I can ask you to put on your pretend virtual goggles for a moment or two, and perhaps just close your eyes for a minute and picture the gentleman who I've shown in the photo there. I should have asked you to look at him first before asking you to close your eyes. But that said, please have a look at that image and then close your eyes momentarily. What I'd like you to do is just to reflect on the impact of an event like that on someone like that. And then I want to explain in a moment or two just what some of those impacts were, are, and can be, just to really clarify what I think is the reason that we're all in the business that we're in some way, shape or form. So give that 30 seconds if you would. Okay, so we know that disasters are varying. They have different impacts on different people, different individuals, even within household groups who go through the same experience. We know they can cause loss of life and injury, loss of homes, and I strongly support Ian's observation early in the piece that people don't lose houses necessarily, they lose homes, which is even more significant. There's a financial burden in a lot of cases. There's loss of livelihoods. Pets and animals can be impacted and the grief that comes with that. The loss of possessions, loss of place, and others. Now, the gentleman in the photo there, his name is Peter, and he is standing in a place on the urban fringes of Melbourne called King Lake in the day or two after the Black Saturday bushfires way back in 2009, which is a long time ago now for many of us. What I would like to share with you is some of the experience. I don't know Peter, but I know a couple of our people who took the photo, and having used this photo in other presentations over a long period of time, along the way I bump into people who do know him and I hear little snippets of his story. Now, Peter is actually a musician. He lives in this place called King Lake, where a lot of his work was done playing in local pubs, cafes, those sorts of things, sort of semi-country, semi-rural community. So where he's standing there is in front of what was his home. If you look closely, you'll see a number of things. Obviously, his home is devastated. So he's going to have all those challenges of insurance, of rebuilding or re-renting, depending on his circumstance. I don't know what that was. We don't know exactly what he's lost, but his prized possessions, whatever they may have been, would obviously have gone up in the fire. So he's facing all of that. If you look in the background, though, you'll see another house, presumably in the block behind him or alongside him, and that's still standing. Now, that to me is quite telling, because when you start to unpick these experiences, you start to look at the community fabric and the impact of these events on that as much as on the individuals. So for Peter, he's faced with this mammoth task of rebuilding his life from literally the ground up. But at the same time, he's got some neighbours who knows what their experience was on the day. Their house is still standing, and that will bring with it, I guess, some relief, but it will also bring stigma and challenge as the recovery process unfolds and different people react to one another in different ways within their community. To take it a little further, We know that a lot of lives were lost in Kinglake on the day of those fires. So Peter will have lost, if not loved ones, certainly friends, perhaps neighbours. That's another layer of impact and probably the most substantial one. He's now looking for somewhere to work because the places he used to play are either burnt out or they've been turned into evacuation centres or the like, or relief centres. So they're no longer available to him. He may or may not have insurance to cover what he's lost. Likely there will be a change in planning and building regulations. So even if he does have insurance and financial capacity, the cost of rebuilding will be more than what he would have bargained for and what the insurance company would have talked to him about. He'll have challenges finding builders if we can get the work done. And the experience on the day will live with him for a long time in different ways, shapes and forms. Trying to say is recovery from these events is a long, challenging and often exhausting process. Moving house is considered one of the 5 most stressful things you can do, and that's when you're doing it by choice, not by necessity. There's probably a number of people here and online who have either built a home or renovated a house, again by choice. Think about how long that took from the initial idea to actually putting the key in the door. Then you layer on top of that all the other challenges that I spoke of. I vividly recall after these fires, one of the key people in the governance arrangements set up to manage the reconstruction made the observation, we want to get these communities rebuilt quicker than what they rebuilt after the Canberra fires, which was the preceding bushfire relative to that one. I made the point that it's actually not, you're not actually building a subdivision. You're not doing a housing subdivision. You're working with people who have all sorts of complexities in their lives, and they will be challenged by decisions along the way. That's the experience we're going through. We can add a further layer, and the focus of this year's International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction is around poverty and inequity. Disasters and emergencies, no matter their background or status, they can affect us all. No matter our background or status, they can affect us all, but they don't necessarily do that in equal measures. Experience and research tell us that disasters are profoundly discriminatory, both in where they strike and the way that they affect people. The primary indicator of vulnerability as it relates to disasters is poverty. The financial capacity of households affects both how quickly and how effectively people recover from emergencies. Low-income Australians have the least resources, obviously, to dedicate to recovery after a loss, but also significantly, they can least afford the protection and security provided by preparing in the first place. Disasters can also drive people at risk of poverty into poverty. We saw some footage from one of the groups earlier around the floods in Queensland back in 2011. Those floods had a disproportionate impact on people already in poverty, particularly as a result of a few things: a lack of or underinsurance, loss of employment through disruptions or closures of local businesses, loss of rental tenancies and inability to meet higher bond payments and rents after the event, increased pressure on public housing waiting lists, and increased living costs. So all of those things today, 10, 12 years on, are just as significant, if not amplified, particularly things around rental accommodation and the availability of it. Research also tells us that the burden of lost income after disasters is not borne equally. Typically, low income earners, small business owners, and part-time workers are those most likely to lose income following a disaster. Middle and high income earners, full-time workers, and owners of larger businesses are less likely to lose income. It's not a blanket statement. Disasters can affect everyone and anyone in different ways, but they do so in a disproportionate way. And that's something that we need to be extremely aware of into the future in whatever work that we're doing. So essentially, disasters exacerbate, accentuate, and in some cases create disadvantage. One of the key reasons disaster risk reduction is so fundamentally important into the future. Changing tack slightly, and I wanted to touch on the growing importance of research in the sector that many of us work in. Why is research important and what role does it play? In the 15 years or so that I've had the privilege of working with Red Cross, we've done a lot of really good, what I consider really valuable things. And a lot of that is done by volunteers who are out in the community in T-shirts, providing support in the aftermath of some of the events that we've spoken of today. Two of the things that I'm most significantly proud of, though, have been heavily influenced by research. The first of those is our involvement in the formation of a group called the Australian Business Roundtable for Disaster Resilience. And the second is our collaboration with the University of Melbourne and others in a thing called the Beyond Bushfires project. The approach that those two entities has taken to research has been somewhat different. The first, the Business Roundtable, very much the style of a short and sharp thing done by a large consultancy. But the second, the University of Melbourne, ongoing research and longitudinal research over a long period of time. Significantly, though, each of the approaches had two things in common. A collaborative approach to consider, to better understand and address large-scale need for change and improvement. In other words, getting together with people to deal with the wicked problem or the wicked problems that Ian has referenced previously. And secondly, and probably most importantly, both have driven changes to policy and practice to reduce the impact of disasters. They've led to what I would suggest is transformational change. A little bit of detail very quickly on those two things. The Business Roundtable was got together by a bunch of CEOs, notably from 5 very large corporates in the country. Together with Red Cross, they invited us in as a humanitarian partner. It began in 2012 after those floods of 2010-11 and also the Black Saturday bushfires. And the driver of that group of CEOs getting together was to tackle the big issue of the impact of these recurring disasters, both human and financial. So different perspectives, but dealing with the same wicked problem. The initial report that was developed by Deloitte in partnership with the Business Roundtable was launched in about 2013, and it shone a light on the imbalance of investment in disasters and shone an even brighter light on the really important issue that is now being addressed more and more, the need for more to be spent or more invested in building resilience for Australian communities. Not long after was a Productivity Commission review of disaster funding arrangements, and the policy change has grown momentum over the last 10 years through the various different events that we've seen, fires, floods, cyclones, and the like. I'm not standing here claiming that the Business Roundtable sorted this and created the whole investment in resilience that we're seeing at present, but I think they sowed some really important seeds that have ultimately led to a massive policy change or a shift in the way that funds are invested. The second piece of work that the Business Roundtable did was to something very dear to those of us in Red Cross in particular, was to try and do something no one had previously done, or at least that we weren't aware of, and that was to put a dollar cost against the social impact of natural disasters. So for decades, insurance industry and others have talked about this disaster costs X billion dollars. It's a really significant event because it costs this much. What they hadn't been factoring in up until more recently is the very human and social costs of those events. And the work that, again, Deloitte did off the back of that first report was to identify and do some economic modelling that showed us that, in fact, the economic costs of the social impacts were just as significant as the built and infrastructure costs that had previously been identified by insurance and other agencies. So you can, in fact, double the amount of impact in financial terms. And what that did was provide a really good platform to argue the importance of things like social capital, of the importance of social functioning, and the impact that disasters have on the community and people's livelihoods. And that, I think, was a big shift for a lot of people. The second thing, very briefly, the Beyond Bushfires work of University of Melbourne. They led a collaboration with a number of partners that set up a longitudinal study and insight into the human impacts following those Black Saturday bushfires. Initially to run for a 10-year period, which passed in 2019, and it has since been refunded through various different ways and morphed into a project now called Beyond Disasters. It's led to, I would suggest, improved insight and understanding, again, of those very human impacts of disasters at an individual and community level, and in its own way has driven some significant policy change. And as an organisation that has been in the business of providing recovery services to people for a long time after disasters, typically, if you go back 10, 15 years, those recovery programs would last for 6 to 12 months because that was usually the funding that was available to put those services on the ground. Nowadays, we run recovery programs that go for 3 years plus. And I think that's a massive change that has been brought about through the efforts of some of the research work. And that continues onward and upward, hopefully. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about was where to from here. The examples I've given you are in the past. They've dealt with wicked problems and continue to contribute to dealing with wicked problems. But where do we go to next? What lies ahead? And just in doing that, a quick snapshot to give you a sense of the scale of effort that goes into disasters, the scale of impact on Australian communities, but also the way in which those events stretch the ability of the emergency management system and the different organisations within it. That gives you a snapshot of some of the work Red Cross has done in terms of disasters in 2022 and 23, that financial year, and you get a sense of the scale of the challenge, obviously for the community in the first instance, but also for those of us who work in organisations that deal with these things. So, to some of the current concerns and drivers. We've heard quite a bit today about climate change, and there's no question that is the driver that we're going to deal with over the next little while. Ironically, the Business Roundtable report that I first spoke of back in 2013, one of the great debates then was, do we acknowledge climate change in the report or do we not talk about it? 10 years ago, we were having that debate. I don't know whether we should be happy that we now accept it and it's really a debate that is no longer, or should we be unhappy that that became inevitable? I'll leave you to be the judges on that one. What I would flag, though, is that there will be other challenges. And while we obviously need to focus our energies on climate change, I don't question that for a second. We also need to build systems and approaches and enable communities to be resilient for all sorts of challenges that will inevitably come. Who could have foretold the pandemic of a few years ago? Who could have foretold the impact it would have on us as a community? And speaking in Melbourne as, you know, in many ways the Southern Hemisphere's COVID capital in terms of lockdowns and the like, the challenges that that brought and the impacts that that continues to bring for people who live through that experience are boundless, and they will happen. The geopolitical situation that I mentioned earlier, inevitably that will have impacts as well. What I would ask is that you consider at the end of the day, going back to those original couple of images, the one of Peter up in the left there, and of a young mother with a couple of young children in somewhere in Queensland in those floods, which could have been in 2011, could have been in many flood events since or before. I leave you with those two simple images because I think ultimately they represent a great reminder of the significance and primacy of the human impacts of disasters, whatever their cause may be. I encourage those of you who are involved in research to go big in your ambitions. Think about those wicked problems, and we've heard some of that today, and that's been fantastic. There can be incremental change, and that is invaluable, but transformational change is one step better again. In doing that, I would like to think that we can drive changes in the way people live, improve the practice of organisations involved in the sector or various sectors involved to alleviate the very real human impacts, the disadvantage and the inequity that are inevitably wrought by disasters, thereby contributing to disaster risk reduction in the most meaningful way possible. Thanks, Ian. Over to you.